The house on Carolina Street stood unassuming, a modest, weathered structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. To most, it was just another home in Gary, Indiana, one of many forgotten by time. But for LaToya Ammons and her 3 children, it became the gateway to a living nightmare. LaToya had always been practical, a single mother doing her best to provide for her family. When they moved into the house in late 2011, she thought it would be a fresh start. Her children, ages 7, 9, and 12, seemed excited by the new space, running through the empty rooms and planning where their toys would go. But from the first night, something felt wrong. The air inside was thick, heavier than it should have been. LaToya dismissed it as her imagination. The stress of moving, she thought. But when a fly buzzed past her face in the dead of winter, and she noticed dozens more clinging to the window in the living room, unease began to stir. She grabbed a rolled-up magazine and swatted at them, but no matter how many she killed, more seemed to appear the next day. It became a daily ritual to sweep away their tiny, lifeless bodies. The strangeness escalated quickly. Late one evening, as LaToya tucked her youngest son into bed, a guttural groan echoed through the house. It sounded human, but distorted, like a voice twisted in pain. She froze, her heart pounding. The sound had come from the basement. Trying to stay calm, she kissed her son on the forehead and closed his door softly. She tiptoed down the creaky stairs, gripping a flashlight. The basement smelled damp and faintly metallic. Her light caught the shadows of the exposed beams and shelves cluttered with old tools. But as she scanned the room, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the feeling of being watched made her skin crawl. She backed out of the basement, locking the door behind her. That night, her sleep was restless. She dreamed of a figure standing at the foot of her bed, its face obscured by darkness. When she woke, the room was icy cold, and the faint sound of whispering tickled her ears. She convinced herself it was just the wind. The children began to notice it too. They complained of hearing footsteps in the hallway at night and seeing dark shapes moving just beyond their line of sight. One evening, as LaToya cooked dinner, her eldest daughter screamed from the living room. She rushed in to find the child pointing at a corner. "What happened?" LaToya asked, her voice trembling. Her daughter's eyes were wide with terror. "It's standing right there, Mom. It's watching us." LaToya saw nothing but an empty corner. She held her daughter tightly, telling her it was just her imagination, but the knot of fear in her stomach told her otherwise. The most disturbing incident happened when her middle child, her 9-year-old daughter, began to convulse. It was a calm Sunday afternoon, and the family had gathered in the living room to watch a movie. Suddenly, the girl's body stiffened, and she fell to the floor. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she began to thrash violently. LaToya and her mother, Rosa, tried to hold her down, but she seemed impossibly strong. The girl let out a deep, guttural growl that didn't sound human. The episode lasted minutes, but felt like hours. When it was over, the girl had no memory of what had happened. Rosa suggested they see a doctor, but LaToya felt certain this was no medical issue. As the days turned into weeks, the activity in the house grew more sinister. Loud thuds echoed through the walls at all hours of the night, and disembodied footsteps creaked across the ceiling. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the children began waking with scratches and bruises. LaToya found herself praying constantly, pleading for protection. One evening, Rosa was praying in the living room when she felt a sharp sting across her cheek, as though someone had slapped her. Startled, she opened her eyes to see a dark figure standing near the doorway. Its outline was human but indistinct, like smoke caught in the shape of a man. It didn't move but radiated a malevolent presence that made her feel sick. "You don't belong here," Rosa muttered, clutching her rosary tightly. The figure vanished, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. Exploring the house's history revealed a chilling pattern. Decades ago, The basement had been the site of a grisly event. A tenant in the 1940s was rumored to have dabbled in occult practices, attempting rituals to summon something from beyond. Witness accounts claimed strange symbols had been found etched into the foundation, though they had since faded with time. A series of tragic events followed: mysterious deaths, inexplicable disappearances, and most notably, stories of people fleeing the house in terror, never to return. LaToya and Rosa also learned that several previous owners had reported the same phenomena: footsteps, cold drafts, and the sensation of being watched. But none stayed long enough to uncover the truth. The house had always seemed to attract darkness. Desperate for answers, LaToya turned to her church. A priest visited the home, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. As he moved through the house, the temperature dropped sharply, and the smell of decay filled the air. "There is something malevolent here," he warned. "Something that doesn't want to leave." It was during this time that the most infamous event occurred. LaToya's youngest son had been unusually quiet all day, barely eating or speaking. That night, as Rosa and LaToya sat in the living room discussing the priest's warnings, they heard a scream from the children's room. They ran to find the boy standing on his bed, his eyes black as coal. With a growl that didn't belong to a child, he launched himself backward. Rosa screamed as she watched him rise in the air, his small body suspended. He slammed against the wall and collapsed in a heap. The family rushed to him, but he stood on his own, smiling eerily. He raised a finger to his lips. "Shh! He's watching," he whispered. The ordeal reached the authorities after LaToya confided in a caseworker, desperate for help. A child services investigation brought outsiders into the house, and even the skeptics left shaken. A caseworker and a police officer witnessed the youngest child climbing backward up a wall, defying gravity, before flipping to the ground unharmed. The police investigation uncovered something chilling in the basement. Beneath the stairs, they found a patch of dirt that seemed disturbed, as though something had been buried there long ago. Despite their efforts to dig, they uncovered nothing, only the unsettling feeling that something was watching them as they worked. "I've seen a lot in my career," the officer later admitted, but that was something else. The family ultimately fled, leaving everything behind. They moved into a new home and the strange occurrences stopped. Paranormal investigators who later explored the Carolina Street house described it as a vortex of dark energy, a place where the veil between worlds had thinned dangerously. But for LaToya Ammons and her children, the scars remained. Some nights, LaToya would wake to the sound of faint whispers, her body cold with the memory of the house. She would check on her children, ensuring they were safe and asleep. But every so often she swore she saw a shadow pass across the room, silent, waiting, and unrelenting. The house on Carolina Street still stood, empty and rotting, but the darkness within never truly left. The move into the quaint Connecticut home should have been a fresh start for the Glatzel family. Nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the house felt warm and inviting at first, perfect for Judy and Carl Glatzel, their young son David, and their teenage daughter Debbie, who was engaged to Arne Johnson. But before the first night ended, shadows began to take root. David, an 11-year-old boy with a shy smile and gentle demeanor, was the first to sense that something was off. That night, as the house settled into silence, a scream ripped through the stillness. Judy bolted from her bed, her heart racing as she ran to David's room. She found him curled up in the corner of his bed, trembling violently. "Mom," he whimpered, his voice barely audible. "There's a man in the room." Judy scanned the dimly lit space. Nothing. Just the faint outline of toys and furniture illuminated by moonlight. "David, there's no one here," she said, her voice calm but firm. But as she pulled him into her arms, she felt a chill settle over the room. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from an open window. It was deeper, heavier, almost alive. She shivered but brushed it off, tucking David back into bed. The following nights brought more screams. David would wake in a cold sweat, his cries echoing through the house. "He's watching me," he whispered one night, pointing toward the closet. "He has sharp teeth, and he smiles too much." Carl checked the closet and the windows. Nothing. But the atmosphere in David's room felt wrong, as if the air itself was suffocating. David began refusing to sleep in his room, begging to stay in his parents' bed. Judy, desperate to comfort her son, agreed, but even there the nightmares followed. The boy's behavior changed rapidly. Once mild-mannered, he became erratic and angry, throwing tantrums over trivial matters. Judy found him sitting on the floor one afternoon, his head tilted at an odd angle as he whispered to someone unseen. "David, who are you talking to?" she asked cautiously. He looked up, his eyes wide and unblinking. "He says he doesn't like you." It wasn't long before the physical manifestations began. Judy noticed scratches on David's arms, deep red welts that seemed to appear overnight. One morning, he complained that his back hurt, and when she lifted his shirt, she gasped. Etched into his skin were 3 long parallel scratches, as if made by claws. "I didn't do this," David cried. "It was him." Objects began to move on their own. Plates slid off the kitchen counter and shattered on the floor. Doors slammed shut without warning. The family would hear footsteps pacing the hallway at night, but when they checked, no one was there. Debbie, David's older sister, became increasingly concerned. She had always been protective of her little brother, but now she barely recognized him. His voice seemed deeper, his eyes darker. One night, as she helped him with his homework, he suddenly froze, staring at her with an intensity that made her stomach turn. "What's wrong, David?" she asked. He leaned closer, his lips curling into a sinister grin. "He says he'll take you next." Debbie backed away, her hands shaking. "Who?" she whispered. But David just laughed, a guttural, inhuman sound that echoed through the house. Desperate for help, Judy contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned paranormal investigators. When they arrived, Lorraine immediately sensed the presence. "There's something here," she said, her voice trembling, "and it's powerful." The Warrens observed David over the next few days, documenting his behavior. During one encounter, the boy sat in the middle of the living room, rocking back and forth. Lorraine approached him cautiously. "David, can you hear me?" she asked. He stopped rocking and turned to her, his expression blank. Then, in a voice that was not his own, he said, "I know who you are, Lorraine. You can't save him." The exorcisms began shortly after. A local priest joined the Warrens in their effort to rid David of the entity or entities plaguing him. During the first session, David's body convulsed violently. He thrashed against the restraints, screaming in a language no one understood. His small frame contorted in unnatural ways, his limbs bending at impossible angles. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air became thick with the smell of sulfur. Lorraine watched in horror as dark shadows seemed to writhe along the walls, their forms flickering and shifting. "It's not just one," she whispered to Ed. "There are many." David let out a piercing scream, his eyes rolling back in his head. When he opened them again, they were pitch black. "He belongs to us," a voice growled, low and guttural, as the boy's lips twisted into a sneer. The exorcisms continued for weeks. Each session was more intense than the last. At one point, David's small body levitated off the bed, his hands clawing at the air as if fighting something unseen. Lorraine felt a crushing weight on her chest, as if the entities were trying to force her out. But it wasn't just David who suffered. Arne, Debbie's fiancé, began experiencing strange phenomena. He would wake with scratches on his chest and arms, and he claimed to hear whispers calling his name. One night, he woke to find David standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him. "What are you doing here?" Arne demanded, his voice shaky. David tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the darkness. "He says it's your turn." The final exorcism was the most harrowing. David's screams echoed through the house as the priest recited the prayers. The shadows in the room grew darker, almost solid, and the furniture trembled. David let out a guttural roar, his voice layered with others, as if multiple entities were speaking through him. Suddenly, he went still. The room fell silent, and for a moment it seemed as though the ordeal was over. But then David opened his eyes and looked directly at Arnie. "He'll take you instead," he whispered. David's condition improved after that night. The scratches stopped appearing, and his nightmares faded. But Arne wasn't so lucky. He became increasingly volatile, complaining of a presence following him. Months later, he snapped, killing his landlord in a brutal attack. During his trial, he claimed demonic possession, pointing to the events with David as evidence. Though David was freed from his torment, the family never truly escaped the shadows that had plagued them. Lorraine often said that she could still feel the darkness lurking, waiting for its next victim. And perhaps in the quiet corners of that Connecticut home, it still lingers, feeding on fear and waiting for another door to open. In the quiet Bavarian town of Klingenberg, Germany, a darkness took root in the life of a young woman named Anneliese Michel, whose harrowing ordeal would become one of the most infamous cases of exorcism in modern history. Born on September 21, 1952, Anneliese was raised in a strict Roman Catholic household, where her devout parents instilled in her a deep fear of sin and the eternal consequences of damnation. From a young age, she was pious, prayerful, and shy, the kind of girl who attended Mass regularly and confessed often. But as she reached adolescence, something sinister began to unfurl in the shadows of her seemingly normal life. It started innocuously. At 16, Anneliese experienced her first seizure, a sudden, violent convulsion that left her disoriented and terrified. Doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition known to cause seizures, memory loss, and, in some cases, vivid hallucinations. She was prescribed medication and sent on her way, but the episodes only grew worse. Over time, her seizures were accompanied by nightmarish visions and sounds. She claimed to hear voices, low, mocking whispers that taunted her, threatening her with torment and demanding her submission. At first, her family dismissed these as byproducts of her illness, but Anneliese herself was certain something far more sinister was at work. By the early 1970s, Anneliese's condition had escalated beyond anything medical science could explain. She began to act strangely, recoiling violently at the sight of crucifixes and holy water. Her family noticed she refused to enter churches and avoided sacred objects like they were burning her skin. At night, her once quiet prayers turned into guttural growls and frantic screams. She spoke of shadowy figures with grotesque faces that loomed over her bed, whispering unspeakable horrors into her ears. Her body, once vibrant and healthy, began to deteriorate. She stopped eating, insisting that the voices forbade her from consuming food. Her once bright eyes grew dark and sunken, her face gaunt and pale. She started losing control of her limbs, twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. Her parents, devout Catholics, grew desperate. Medical treatments and therapy had done nothing. Their daughter was slipping further into what they believed to be the clutches of demonic forces. When Anneliese began growling and speaking in languages she had never learned, her family turned to the church for help. In 1975, after years of pleading with local priests, they found Father Ernst Alt and Father Arnold Renz, who both believed Anneliese's symptoms aligned with the classic signs of demonic possession. They petitioned the bishop for permission to perform an exorcism. The church, reluctant to intervene in such matters, eventually gave its blessing under strict guidelines. Thus began a year-long spiritual battle that would claim Anneliese's life. The exorcisms were grueling, terrifying affairs. Over the course of 67 sessions, Anneliese endured hours of prayers, invocations, and rituals designed to expel the entities that had taken hold of her. Each session was a descent into the abyss. She would writhe violently on the floor, her body convulsing as though invisible hands were crushing her from within. Her voice would shift unnaturally from a deep, guttural growl to high-pitched screeches that echoed like tortured cries. At times, she spoke in Latin and Aramaic, languages she had no way of knowing. She identified herself as being possessed by multiple demons, each vying for control of her body. Among them were Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Cain, and even Adolf Hitler. These entities taunted the priests, laughing at their prayers and mocking their faith. Her physical strength was astonishing. During one session, she threw a grown man across the room with a single shove. She would thrash so violently that it often took multiple people to restrain her. On several occasions, she climbed walls and leaped from furniture with animalistic agility. Her screams pierced through the air, raw and inhuman, shaking the resolve of even the most seasoned priests. Anneliese's behavior grew increasingly grotesque. She began eating insects, spiders, and bits of coal, claiming it was the only sustenance she needed. She would drink her own urine and chew on shards of glass, seemingly immune to the pain. Her family witnessed her twist her limbs at unnatural angles, her bones cracking audibly, though she showed no signs of injury. She would stay awake for days, her eyes wide and bloodshot, muttering incoherent phrases in voices that weren't her own. Despite her torment, Anneliese begged for the exorcisms to continue. She believed she was a vessel for suffering, chosen by God to atone for the sins of the world. Her parents and the priests shared her conviction, convinced that her sacrifice was necessary to banish the evil within her. By June 1976, Anneliese was on the brink of death. Her body was skeletal, her face sunken, her skin stretched taut over protruding bones. She refused food and water, claiming the demons would punish her if she ate. In her final sessions, she barely spoke, her voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. On July 1st, 1976, after months of agony, Anneliese Michel died in her sleep. She weighed just 68 pounds. Her death sent shockwaves through the community and sparked a criminal investigation. The priests and her parents were charged with negligent homicide. During the trial, audio recordings of the exorcisms were played in court, capturing the terrifying sounds of Anneliese's screams, growls, and the voices of the supposed demons. The defense argued that Anneliese had willingly undergone the exorcisms, convinced she was possessed. The prosecution contended that her death was the result of untreated mental illness and neglect. The court ultimately found the defendants guilty, sentencing them to 6 months in prison and 3 years of probation. But the trial did little to quell the lingering questions surrounding Anneliese's case. Was she the victim of a severe mental illness misunderstood through the lens of religious fervor? Or did she truly endure a battle with demonic forces that cost her life? Today, Anneliese Michel's story continues to haunt those who hear it. Her grave in Klingenberg has become a site of pilgrimage, drawing believers and skeptics alike. The recordings of her exorcisms remain some of the most chilling evidence ever documented, a harrowing testament to the terror she endured. For many, Anneliese Michel's story is proof that evil walks among us, waiting for an invitation into the human soul. This is a story that lingers, not just in history, but in the darkest corners of imagination. Thank you for watching this video by Sanctum Obscura. If you enjoyed unraveling the darkness with us, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some mysteries are better left in the shadows. See you next time.